Robert Ripley. And it's now Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. So it's another castle on our tour. Another castle, and probably the coolest, crazy, zany one, is out on Volano Beach Road, Castle Otis. You notice the spelling has 3 T's, that's not a mistake. This was designed by Randy Ix and his friend Otis something or other. And they built it not as a castle, but as just a landscape sculpture. And it got out of hand, and they kept building and building for years and years. And now it's a nice place where you can go and have your wedding or have your pictures taken for events like that. It's kind of an event venue. There's one more castle to show you, and that's the Pink Castle. As you're going to St. Augustine, if you turn off on Volano Beach Road, on the left, you'll see this crenellated building. That was the home of Charles Adrian Pillars. Now, Pillars was the one who designed the Memorial Park statue. And if you look at that upper part of the building on the left, you notice it's 3 stories tall. That was his studio, which was tall enough that he could build these enormous statues like the Memorial Park statue. And the ironic thing about this one is he didn't use blueprints. He was a sculptor, so he made a model of it out of clay and built his house from that clay model. Now, I'm very particular about this because not only do I live close to the Memorial Park statue, it's one of my favorite works of art. In fact, it's probably the greatest outdoor work of art in the state of Florida. But I also happen to write a book about Charles Adrian Pillars, and for a very small fee, you can buy one as you go out the door. And I'll be glad to sign it for you. Pillars was an amazing guy. His story is the most rollicking adventure, tragedy, and triumph I've ever written in my life. And apropos to that, in studying for the book, we discovered that Pillars designed a statue of Neptune that was 18 feet tall, intended to go to the gateway to the sea in Neptune Beach. He died just as this statue was about to be built. But those clever folks at Neptune Beach Preservation, Allison, the leader of the group here, wave your hand, Allison. Used that picture of Neptune from Pillar Sculpture for the logo on their Neptune Beach Preservation sign. And even better than that, here's a picture we have of, it was a Photoshop at the time, of Pillar standing in front of a blow-up of his model, showing the scale of this statue of Neptune. And you know, folks, we're going to build that. We're going to make this the entranceway to Neptune Beach. So when they pass the hat and ask you to donate to build this 18-foot replica of Pillar's statue of Neptune, pull out your wallet. All right. Let's move on to the second city in our tour, Fernandina. Who knows how Fernandina got its name? Who's it named after?
King Ferdinand.
King Ferdinand of Spain. So why do they call it Amelia Island? Amelia was the daughter of King George of England, and during the time that England owned Florida, that's where they got the name. Now you may notice the name is Fernandina, but we don't call it that today. It is now Fernandina Beach. And in studying to do some research, I was stumped. When did it become Fernandina Beach and not Fernandina? You can see it was founded in 1811, 10 years before Florida became a state. And here's the secret to how it became Fernandina Beach. Here's a map. This was from about 1918. And you see on the map, this is old Fernandina, the original city up here. A man named David Yulee, who was a railroad man, decided to make Fernandina the Manhattan of the South, and it will be the terminus for his new Cross-Florida Railroad. But he didn't want to have to cross the railroad across this swamp, and so he moved the city down to here, and that's where the city of St. Augustine is today. Also, you see a trolley track that goes across the map out to Amelia Island, and there are some little dots. Those dots are beach houses. And very quickly, people started inhabiting the beach. And so in 1952, they decided to change the name from Fernandina to Fernandina Beach. Marketing. beach just sounds better. So in 1951, they passed the law and it became Fernandina Beach in 1952. So don't call it Fernandina anymore. So the cool thing about Fernandina is that it's still there. Because nothing important ever happened much there after that. It's still pretty much intact. There were no big industries came in and took it over. And so this is Center Street 100 years ago, and it still looks just like that today. It's one of the most intact small town main streets left in the state of Florida. And as you walk the streets, there's restaurants and shops and bars and taverns and saloons are all in these old buildings along the main street called Center Street in Fernandina. And it's a delightful place to spend a day. If you've never done just a day trip to Fernandina Beach, it's well worth it. They have a grand courthouse, one of the great courthouses of Florida, built in the 1890s. And the original, not the original railroad station, but the one from 1899. And of course the lighthouse. This is the oldest lighthouse in our collection today, 1839. And they also have a fort. This was the largest brick building in the United States when it was built in 1847 to help in the Seminole Wars, which were going on in the 1830s and 40s. And then you have old wooden buildings like this one. This is where David Hewley made a boarding house for his railroad guests, and it has been turned into a hotel. And it's actually operated since 1859 as a boarding house hotel. It's the oldest operating hotel in Florida, and they have a nice little restaurant there. And I ate lunch there one time. This is becoming a theme. I'm realizing this on the top of my head. So, yeah, join me for lunch. And so let's walk down the streets of Fernandina and just see some of these beautiful old Victorian houses. This one built right at the beginning of the Civil War, and this, another one, 1860. Churches going back to the 1870s. And because Fernandina is relatively compact and small, you can walk this whole area in just a couple of hours and see all of this that you're seeing on the screen today. My favorite house in Fernandina Beach is Fairbanks Folly. This four-story Italianate villa was designed by an architect named Schuyler, Robert Schuyler, and he was the architect of fame in Fernandina Beach. He also designed the tabby house made out of tabby, which is coquina pressed into a concrete mortar to make the house out of. A beautiful house with a lovely two-story veranda. He also designed St. Peter's Episcopal Church, and he designed the Chadwick House. Now, not only did Robert Schuyler appear in Fernandina Beach, but there were many other architects who came here. And the one I want you to look at now, who knows why this house is famous?
Pippi Longstocking.
Oh, y'all are good. This is the house where they filmed the movie Pippi Longstocking. That's an old Fernandina. The captain's house, they call it. And this house is right downtown. Look at all this Victorian porches and turrets and spindles and things. Now, the Horsey House, built in 1902, was designed by an architect you've never heard of. His name was George Franklin Barber. You've all heard of Frank Lloyd Wright and folks like that. George Franklin Barber designed more houses than Frank Lloyd Wright and all the architects who were alive at Frank Lloyd Wright's time put together. He designed more houses than any other architect ever in the history of the world. He published a catalog that was popular throughout the southeastern United States, and he had hundreds of different designs, and these were ordered through mail order, and you would be sent the blueprints for the house, of which you'd have your local carpenter build and follow George Franklin Barber's blueprints. And here you see, this is model 147. And take a close look at that because here's model 147. And these were not just bungalows, they were mansions and all kinds of houses. He sold over 20,000 of these plans, most of which we presume were built. And there are hundreds of them on the National Register throughout the United States. And he wasn't the only architect either, but there are many of these great old houses that we'll just zoom through, as you'll see on your walk through the streets in a wonderful residential neighborhood of Fernandina. Here's the mayor's house next to downtown Villa La Palmas. So now let's turn to the third city, one you might all feel a little specially toward. And it was founded in 1822. We just had our bicentennial a couple years ago. And Jacksonville was known mostly for its fire. After the Civil War, Jacksonville was a great tourist mecca because it was on the ocean, on the river. But by 1901, the tourists had gone. Henry Flagler had taken them down the coast. And Jacksonville was a business center. And on May the 3rd, 1901, 90% of Jacksonville's downtown burned to a crisp. It's the centerpiece of our history. Everything that was built before that was burned downtown, and everything that came after that was a whole new era. The fire was a big one. You have to understand it was the third largest city fire in the history of the United States at that time. You could look up at the sky in Savannah and see the glow of the flames in Jacksonville. Smoke could be seen in the sky in Raleigh, North Carolina. A captain of a ship in Miami looked up and saw two sunsets, one in the west and one in the north. The one in the north was Jacksonville burning. So over 2,378 buildings burned in one afternoon. A swath that was 2 square miles was destroyed, and it made headlines all over the country. Architects and builders poured into the city to rebuild it. But because of the fire, many people have the misconception that Jacksonville doesn't have any buildings before 1900, before the fire in 1801. And that's not true. We have over 100, maybe even 200 houses. And by the way, I do have copies in my book about the Great Fire. All the proceeds go to the Jacksonville History Center. If you don't have that book, it's one of my favorites. So let's go back in time. In Duval County, we have Kingsley Plantation that dates back to 1797, before 1900. And it's one of the only fully intact plantations in the southeastern United States. It has barns and a slave cabin and a cook kitchen house. And it's a wonderful day trip. If you haven't been to Fort George Island, I highly recommend it. It's very scenic nature as well as this wonderful ancient architecture. But there are other houses that date back to the plantation era too. The Rickard House, 1848, over near Empire Point. The Red Bank Plantation in Southside, 1854. The Samus Plantation, built in the 1850s. So these are some really old buildings that definitely predate the fire. Even in Riverside, we have the old Jardin Plantation House dating to the 1850s as well. And then, of course, there's the Lighthouse at Mayport before the Civil War. And this is one of my favorite old houses, built in 1867 as Riverside House. It was part of the tourist era of Jacksonville. It was a hotel built near downtown. It's about where the Florida Humanities building used to be before it was torn down. And it was called Riverside House, and one of its most famous guests was Mary Todd Lincoln, who spent the winter there in 1874 after the death of her husband Abraham. And in 1912, they moved this old hotel building on a barge down the river to River Boulevard at the foot of Goodwin Street in Riverside. So here we have the only remaining hotel from Jacksonville's tourist heyday, parked right in the middle of historic Riverside. And then if you go to Mandarin, there are dozens and dozens of old houses that go back to right after the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the woman who, Abraham Lincoln said, the little woman who started the Civil War with her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She built this as a school for freed slaves, and although her house has been torn down, the school is still there and is the Mandarin Community Club, dating to the 1870s, as does this old house, the King House. And although Mandarin's been built up, all these houses, or many of these houses are still there in their same original configuration. they were just like a quarter of a mile apart, and now subdivisions have come in between. But if you squint real good and look, you can see Old Mandarin with dozens of old houses that still exist. On Fort George Island, we have Governor Broward's house dating back to 1878. And the same year, 1878, is Old St. Luke's Hospital over by the Jaguar Stadium. This is owned by the Jacksonville History Center, which has its office and headquarters there. And it is the oldest hospital in the state of Florida. Another hospital was Brewster Hospital, originally built as a residence, but it became a hospital for nurses, African-American nurses. And if you want to know the date on this one, you can look carefully at the top of the columns. It says 1885. The date is built into the gingerbread. More houses like this one at St. Nicholas, dated well before the fire. On the left, you see the Merrill House dating from 1880, also part of the Jacksonville History Center's complex of buildings, and it's a house museum. And if you ever have a chance to go through it, it is probably one of the best house museums I've ever been in. Next door to that is Old St. Andrew's Church, which is where the Jacksonville Historical Society has many of its meetings and events. And it was also designed by the Fernandina architect, Robert Schuyler, the biggest building he ever did. This building was built in 1900 as a cigar factory, and then later it was bought by Eagle Film Studios and became a silent film studio. Later it was bought by Richard Norman, who continued to make silent movies there, but they were African-American cowboy movies. And the significance of this, it's a 5-complex wooden building, and it is one of only 2 silent movie studios left in the entire world, right on Arlington Boulevard. And then we get to the beach. We have houses like the Striker house next door, dates 1873. If you need to go to the bathroom, you can go there and say, ask me. And the oldest house that originally in its original location at the beach is this one. Who knows the name of that house? I was hoping you said it because I just forgot it. Okay. Anyway.
He's German.
And then we're in one of the oldest buildings at the beach, dating back to 1887, St. Paul by the Sea.
Yay.
And next door we have a railroad station from Mayport. You know why all these buildings are painted yellow, right? Henry Flagler painted every hotel and building on his railroad from here all the way to Key West yellow, so that when his employees would get off the train, they would know exactly where to go. That yellow building. And there are many old buildings at the beach, like the Cash and Bedell House, the oldest house at Neptune Beach. And here we come to a house at Empire Point that has a lot of things we've already seen. You see gingerbread porches, you see a tall tower. Whenever I go to visit a neighborhood or a town, I look around and say, what time is it? And you can tell the time by the architecture, by what style is it. This is a Queen Anne style, part of the Victorian architectural period, and you know that this was built between 1880 and 1910. So that you see this house, also in Springfield, with that turret mostly. If you see a turret on a house, you know what time it is. It's around 1900. This house is the Ricker House, built in 1893. It was built for the family that had the Coca-Cola franchise. And back in the 70s, they converted this to a restaurant called the Queen Creole. And I just realized I'm talking to you. I ate lunch there too. I had my first muffaletta sandwich in that house. Wow. And then you look at this house. It's shingle style. Shingle style is typified by the roof, the walls, the columns, everything being covered by shingles, in this case by cedar shingles, and they didn't need to be painted, and it's a perfect style to build at the beach. These originated up in the New England seacoast towns where you have prevailing winds and sand blowing, and paint doesn't work very well, so If you see a building like this, you know you're somewhere between 1880 and 1910. As you see many of these buildings at the beach, you go back to the same era, around 1880 to 1900, up to 1910. So now when you see a beach house, and by the way, these are being lost at a very rapid rate. Some of the buildings I've just showed you, I fear have been torn down since I took the picture, because they're an old building, they have charm and history, and yet they're located where somebody coming from New Jersey wants to build their mansion. We must stop them. There are even shingle-style houses in Riverside. This was built around the turn of the century and is a wonderful bed and breakfast. I ate lunch there too. Okay, then you see a building with columns. The Great World's Fair in Chicago, 1893. Did you all read Devil in the White City about the Chicago World's Fair? It was a neoclassical orgy of architecture where all the buildings were these great white Beaux-Arts palaces reflecting Rome and Greece. And it was such a popular event. 1/3 of the American population went to the World's Fair in Chicago and was exposed to these great white buildings. And so after that, every library, Jacksonville Public Library, bank, the Marble Bank in downtown Jackson, train station, post office, mansion, all evoked this same classical style because it showed power and influence, and it was very popular among the wealthy to build their mansions in this neoclassical style. So you say, what time is it? You know, it's between 1893 and about 1920. Uh-oh, this house is very, very different. A man named Henry Clutho was a New York architect who read about the Great Fire in the New York Times, and within 2 months had moved here and began building buildings like the one we just saw in very classical style. He went to the World's Fair and was very impressed with neoclassicism. But in 1904, Clutho went on his honeymoon to Niagara Falls and stopped by nearby Buffalo, New York, and met a guy named Frank Lloyd Wright, who was building buildings that totally avoided the classical styles. All the European styles were fake, he said. We want to build a new American style of architecture that has strong horizontal lines like the unbridled plains of the great prairie of the Midwest. They call it the prairie style, with large window openings, bands of windows that connect you with nature, porches and terraces, wide overhanging eaves, so that your connection with nature was complete. And so Clutho designed many buildings influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright and his mentor Louis Sullivan, like the Shriners Temple, like Clutho Apartments on Main Street. And these are very almost abstract compositions, nothing like the ones we saw before with all of the Victorian frou-frou. These are nice, clean lines. His magnum opus was the Cohen Brothers department store in downtown Jacksonville, which luckily has been restored as Jacksonville City Hall. It is not only one of the largest prairie-style buildings on earth, but it's also the most beautiful city hall in America, if you ask me. And there are many other architects influenced by Clutho and Frank Lloyd Wright who built buildings in Springfield and Riverside particularly in this modern prairie style. It looks avant-garde even today. And here's an avant-garde house that Lana and I live in, and come to think of it, I ate lunch there today. This building is very different. Now it looks more Spanish. It must be in the 1920s. The prairie style evolved from about 1900 with Frank Lloyd Wright up until after World War I. By the end of World War I, the prairie style died out. And then came the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, when Florida land boom created great wealth and real estate, and everybody in the middle class wanted to have a big house that kind of evoked the trappings of Europe, Italy, and Spain. Retrospectively, we call this the Mediterranean Revival style. The most seminal version of that in Jacksonville is Riverside Church, designed by the famed architect Addison Meisner, who did not invent Mediterranean Revival, but he certainly popularized it with the mansions and villas he built in Palm Beach and Boca Raton. This is the only church he ever designed and the only building he built in Jacksonville. But as you go through the streets of Jacksonville and places like San Jose, San Marco, Venetia with Spanish-sounding names, you see these buildings with tile roofs. This was originally the great San Jose Hotel. It only stayed open for 1 year, opened New Year's Day, 1926. In 1 year it closed because of the real estate bust that brought it down, and then it became a school. It's Bowles School, probably the most beautiful high school campus in America. And it's very much this Mediterranean revival style. You'll see marble palaces like this. You'll see Venetian palaces. All these are collectively in the Mediterranean style. They have tile roofs, fancy doorways and entrances, wrought iron balconies, and evoke very much European architecture. Here's an Italianate villa on St. John's Avenue. If Frank Lloyd Wright saw these, he would turn over in his grave. He hated buildings that were borrowed from Europe. But his American ideal never caught on. Here you see a Mediterranean revival house in Neptune Beach. And probably the grandest of all, this was built in the 1930s, in the middle of the Depression, the biggest house in Jacksonville, known as Harlow House, in Atlantic Beach, up in the north end of Atlantic Beach. It's still there today. The sprawling mansion, if you can imagine, was built in the midst of the Depression. And then came other revival styles, not just Italian, Spanish, but you have English styles like Tudor Revival in this great mansion on Richmond Street. The Jacobean Revival, like the house for the founder of Maxwell House Coffee Company. You have Gothic Revival. You notice those pointed windows. If you see that, you know that you're in from 1890 to 1925 or so. Gothic Revival. And then there's Georgian Revival, also 1890 to 1920. Very formal symmetry. So after you leave here, you're going to start becoming an architectural tourist, and you can see some of these buildings, and you'll be able to not just see an old house or an old building, but you'll be able to hopefully remember a little bit of this and learn a little bit more depth about the history of that building. And then there's the bungalow. It was famously said that all that bungalows is not a bungalow. Bungalows were probably the coolest style of architecture invented in the United States. It is a small house, usually 1.5 stories, with the attic space usually is a bedroom, with a gable that opens onto the street, has a porch, built-in furniture. And this was the house for the middle class who couldn't afford the big mansions, but they wanted a house of quality with built-in furniture and design that was beautiful. And so Riverside, Avondale has more bungalows than any other neighborhood in the state of Florida. And then you have Art Deco. The San Marco Theater was Roy Benjamin's great Art Deco palace. We had a lot of Art Deco buildings. Damn. I ate lunch there last week. It's now a pizza joint. I didn't mean this to be a theme, I promise you. There's more Art Deco in the old courthouse and in the Atlantic Beach School. You see Art Deco lines on that. Are we saving that building? There was talk about closing.
They're not closing it.
It's a lovely little building. And then here is a derivation of Art Deco. It's called Art Moderne, or Streamline Moderne, where you start to see rounded corners. And this is ultra modern. When this was built in the 1930s, it was like a Buck Rogers spaceship blasting off. And the guy that is European street restaurant now, and originally when he bought the building, it had the word gas, G-A-S, on that spire on the top. And I begged him to keep it because it was so cool. It used to be a city service station. But he said, no, it's not a real good idea for a restaurant.
You had lunch there.
Did you eat lunch there? Sure.
I ate lunch there in just a few minutes. Down the street is the old Lane drugstore. This is Streamline Moderne. We know in the 1940s. I ate lunch there not too long ago. And the Red Cross building in Jacksonville Beach. Notice the rounded corners on the tower. That's all part of this Art Moderne School of Architecture. Wow. Driving down Beaver Street, if you weren't prepared to see this, you would be in for the shock of your life. This is Beaver Street Baptist Church, built in the 1960s. After World War II, many young architects got out of school, went on the GI Bill, and got their education, and came out excited about modern architecture and the possibilities of concrete. Wonderful concrete geometrical jigsaw puzzle that you imagine how somebody can envision that shape and then make the space inside fits the magic of the geometry. And Ted Pappas also designed the Beach Library, one of your great mid-century modern buildings that is a wonderful work of art based on the Fibonacci triangle number. When you go inside, you can study Fibonacci and see how that works. Then in Arlington, one of the great mid-century banks was built in the 60s, Arlington Federal Savings. This is on University Boulevard. 2 years ago, this was destined to be torn down and turned into a car wash. I gave a speech similar to this one before Old Arlington Preservation 3 years ago and shook them as hard as I could off of the vertical members on the sides so they can float out in space. Who knows what this building is?
Chart house.
It's the Chart House. This is going to blow your mind. I tell you. This was designed by Kendrick Van Kellogg, a great California architect who studied with Frank Lloyd Wright. But the thing that's going to blow your mind about this is I've never eaten lunch there.
How about dinner?
I had dinner there 2 weeks ago, and I'm planning to eat dinner there on Sunday night. Go to the Chart House. It is one of the coolest buildings in Jacksonville. 100 years from now, architectural historians will come to Jacksonville and they'll want to see 3 buildings. The Hayden Burns Library, the St. James Building, or City Hall, and the Chart House. That's how important the building is. Another important architect is Bob Brower. You may know his wonderful houses in Arlington. This is the Butterfly House with its roof sloping inward, so when we get a big rainstorm, the rain torrents off that roof into a pool down below, becoming a sonic and visual delight as part of the house. He also did the Unitarian Church, which is one of the mid-century modern masterpieces of Jacksonville. And he also did the Tree House out at Queens Harbor. This wonderful 4 or 5 story house, it's hard to tell how many stories it has, is built in among the trees. And perhaps his greatest house is the Klein House at Ponte Vedra, with these wonderful cantilever balconies that just fly out into space and connect the occupant with the owner. But the most world-famous house in all of Northeast Florida is Paul Rudolph's Milam House. Paul Rudolph was the Dean of Architecture at Yale or Harvard, one of those. And he was also the founder of the Sarasota School of Architecture. And he built this house for Arthur Milam, and it is known throughout the world. We almost lost it a few years ago in a hurricane, but we still have it. So I've taken you on a quick adventure through our Northeast Florida, and I hope that my talk will spur you on to go out and explore some of these places yourself. You know, we live in this garden of riches, and if you don't take advantage of it, to walk, drive, and travel to see it, then you're missing out on what we have as part of our Florida heritage. And I hope that your journey of discovery will take you some of the same places that I love and found. Thank you so much. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a cell phone, you can take a picture of this, or as you leave, Lana will give you a little sheet of paper